This morning is going to be casuistry. I'm sorry I have to use that, but I use this term, casuistry, maybe somewhat unguardedly in my paper, so it probably needs a well-grounded defense here. But it brings up an issue that really lies at the heart of our study anyway, so I don't think it's a side issue at all. Let me find where I used it. It's one of those technical terms that ethicists use. You'll know exactly what I mean. You probably know the definition. You just don't know that it fits this word. Now, basically, here's what I'm going to say. I'm on the bottom of page 36. Basically, and we want to probably study this twice. We want to look at a short history of casuistry this morning and then try to answer the question, next time we study this, has our study been casuistical legalism or heresy? Basically, we have tried to follow the Reformed casuistic approach to the great subject of truthfulness. This is, remember, toward the end of the paper. Inward sincerity and outward honesty. This means that the agreed upon principle of truthfulness, and that principle being falsehood is never justified, must be carefully and evenly applied to all cases, producing very fine marks of distinction on occasion. God's word is exceedingly broad, Psalm 119:96, but the application is exceedingly narrow. One must be very careful not to make sophistic distinctions that are simply in his own favor. This is a danger that the ethical casuist must strenuously avoid. Now, I say I use it somewhat unguardedly. I don't mean naively, I just mean unguardedly. And the people who read the paper would have known what I meant by that. But if you use that term maybe outside of the context of, other conservative scholars and they can read the paper, I mean, it comes at the end of the paper. I didn't start the paper off and say this is going to be a casuistical study of truthfulness, because then I could have opened a can of worms. But as you read through the whole thing, whoever's reading that will know what my position is. And therefore, the way I've discussed truthfulness would define my understanding of casuistry. And you can have a positive or a negative definition, as I'll give you here in a moment. But as you see from the paper, I said that it poses the problem. We have followed the Reformed casuistic approach to truthfulness, where you take a principle, and that principle being falsehood is never justified. Under no circumstances or in any situations it is not justified, and then you try to apply that to all the different cases that you find in the Bible. And you've seen how difficult sometimes that can be. So that's why I say that just the term casuistry brings up an issue that lies at really the very heart of our studies thus far. Have you noticed how fine some of the distinctions have been? And when we first began looking at a certain text, you were a little confused in your mind? Well, people would say, is this really fair or workable? To take this principle that you have and to go through the Bible and look at these passages and then try to find out now, are they lying or are they not? Some people would say that's really not fair. What if a situation arose in the future that we've never even thought of? How are we going to deal with that then? Are we not being arbitrary? Well, some would say that we're being casuists, and although I did use that term, I would resist being labeled by that because of its general understanding of most people in the world. So here goes an in-depth discussion in a brief fashion of casuistry. Let's start with its meaning. We're going to go through its meaning and history this morning, and then we'll apply it to our own study next time. But it's all based on these first few paragraphs that I've given you already. And you should have noticed how fine these distinctions are sometimes, and it seems like it's difficult. And what if instead of myself being up here with someone else up here, couldn't they have just equally come up with the opposite view? That's what the people would say, and they said that's casuistry then, and that you're going to paint yourself right into a corner. Well, the term I need to spell it for you, I think. Casuistry. 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 Now, it can have good or bad connotations. Usually the latter is implied. But I'll start with the former, since that's how I used it. And since that's the first dictionary's definition anyway. It can be good or bad. Usually, it's used in a bad sense. In other words, on other occasions when I might use the term casuistry or casuist or casuistical, I would probably be using it in an evil sense. That's the general way that it's understood. That's why I have to defend my use of the term casuistry in the paper. Now here's a definition. This is my own, but it's really easy to define. The first dictionary definition. There's a good meaning and a bad meaning. Here's the first meaning, the good meaning, the basic general one, the positive meaning, the first one found in the dictionary. The application of a moral law or principle to the changing circumstances of time. The application of a moral law. See, we do that all the time, but it has a technical, ethical name, casuistry. The application of a moral law or principle to the changing circumstances of time. So we have taken the moral law or principle, first from the Old Testament, the Decalogue, Exodus 20, thou shalt not bear false witness, or the New Testament's principle in Ephesians chapter 4, lie not one to another. So we've taken a principle, thou shalt not lie. And we have seen how it applies to all of the biblical texts and all of the current situations maybe in our life that are in question. Asking ourselves, meanwhile, what is a lie? Notice that we have not ever said that a lie is justified. We've simply been asking ourselves, what is a lie? The Anatomy of a Lie is the paper's title, remember. But smoke immediately rises because of the potential abuse of this. We're taking a principle or a law, thou shalt not lie, and then we're seeing how it applies to all different circumstances of life. Then the danger is, and that would bring us right into the second meaning of the term then, could you not work out the application of your principle in such a wicked way as to almost excuse anything that you needed to excuse in your own life? Take something that says thou shalt not lie and then work it out in such a casuistical fashion so that you get the whole situation swamped around, and right can become wrong and wrong right. But of course then the wrong would be the wrong and the right would be the right. They would swap sides then. And there's where the problem arises with this business of taking a moral principle and trying to apply it. Because what are we trying to prove? Are we trying to justify ourselves somewhere in our life? Are we trying to leave an escape hatch open for us so that we can tell a lie in the future and it won't violate the biblical principle, thou shalt not lie, because of our casuistical application of that principle? So with that in mind, let's give you the second definition then. And here's the second one you'll find in the dictionary. Now the first one was my own. I copied this out of Westminster's Dictionary on Christian Ethics because you can hardly beat this. And here's how the term is almost always understood. So I would generally not want to use it but in this fashion. The employment of, I'll read it through and come back. And here I begin quoting, subtle distinctions and twisted logic in order to justify some act that would be generally considered disreputable. The employment of subtle distinctions. See, some of you have almost thought that's what we were doing, subtle distinctions and twisted logic in order to justify some acts that would be generally considered disreputable. Employment of subtle distinctions. Now this is not my own. This is from Westminster's Dictionary. the employment of subtle distinctions and twisted logic in order to justify some act that would be generally considered disreputable. I have had some people at school who read my paper who they didn't use this term casuistry, but they questioned me about that. Is this not casuistical? And what I mean by that is, well, what's obvious? All these biblical passages that we studied. How can we go over there and say that Jeremiah didn't lie, but that Abraham did lie? Or that Samuel is okay in 1 Samuel 16, and so is Elisha over in 2 Kings chapter 6. Seems like we're taking, they would say, a principle and then unevenly applying it, acquitting some, condemning others, and hopefully building a neat system of proof text and a neat system of, well, as they say here, twisted logic, so that if we ever need that for an escape in our own life, then we'll have it at our disposal. Employing subtle distinctions and twisted logic in order to justify some act that would be generally considered disreputable. I'm continuing. Casuistry is to moral argument what sophistry is to philosophical. Although sometimes the terms are just swapped around also. But casuistry is to moral argument. That is, when you're dealing as an ethicist. Casuistry is to moral argument what sophistry is to a philosopher, to philosophical argument. Continuing with my own now. Unwarranted, vested interests, shady distinctions of dubious character and immoral innards. The Roman Catholic Jesuit doctrine of mental reservation that we discussed before fits square in the center of a casuistical framework, where they say it's all right to lie as long as in your own mind you're telling yourself the truth. Well, you see, that's casuistry. That is to moral argument what sophistry is to philosophical reasoning and argument, where they can say, no, there are no Jews here, and then you finish the sentence in your mind that I will tell you anything about. Now that fits squarely. That is an improper use of moral reasoning and of logic. And that, of course, would fit under this evil, negative definition of casuistry. And that is how it is almost always employed. Very few people that I've ever seen will use the term in its first sense. Some do. But most people, it's used in an evil sense because of the way various religious groups and orders, and you or they might not know these terms, casuistry, but they practice them nevertheless, where it's unwarranted, vested interests, shady distinctions of dubious character and immoral innards. And the Jesuit Roman Catholic doctrine of mental reservation fits smack dab in the center of a casuistical framework, where they have so arranged things that they've made right wrong and wrong right. I mean, it's wrong to tell a lie, but they've made it okay to tell a lie because it's not really a lie. And that's where, we could fall into the same snare there of trying to get such an elaborate framework here that we justify telling a lie. And that's one thing I said in the paper that the ethical casuist must strenuously avoid, making these distinctions in his own favor so that right and wrong switch places, and so that you justify then what would, well, as they say here, generally be considered disreputable. So with that meaning now, I think we can talk about the topic. Let's jump into its history, and I'm sorry, but we're going to give you some more big, long words. We'll get to them here in a few moments, but at least you'll have it down. If you ever see these words again, you'll remember that you heard them or learned of them at one time. And again, you see, you might not have ever heard of that term casuistry, but you know exactly what I'm talking about here. We've already seen this twisted logic at work with the Jesuits. You can see this twisted logic at work in almost everyone. Take Faith Assembly, that says that it's, wrong to do this, and yet they make exceptions over here because it fits them. No women can speak in the church, no women ministry, but women can be in the role of a prophetess because, you see, that fits their foundation of him being called in the ministry. That's casuistry right there. To take a principle, it's not really a moral one there, but to take a principle that women cannot be in ministry, women cannot speak in the church, and then apply that with subtle distinction and twisted logic, so that you end up at the end of the day, and really all we're after, remember, is what people have to say at the end of the day, not what they start, what they finish with. At the end of the day, what you have is, it's all right for women to be in ministry, at least in this one case here. Now, why was that ever done? Because you got to justify your own self, your own ministry, and so you say no, but then you slip around the back door and say yes, 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 once you get inside. That's casuistry. And we have to strenuously avoid that. You see, you practice that, I have too. We practice it in our own life. We condemn others, but with that very argument we condemn others, we have a little escape latch there for us, and we justify ourselves. You might not have known that you call it casuistry, but that's what it is, though. So let's look at its history here. So it's not something just to be studied and, in school, that this was something for the Jesuits back in the first half of the 16th century or something. But it's something that we all have to watch out for and avoid. Well, I think we'll save for next week, though, our arguments as to whether or not that's been our practice in our study here Sunday mornings in Christian ethics on truthfulness, whether it's been a casuistical study in the second definition sense. So a history, brief history, take up the rest of our study this morning. When do we date the beginning of this? I think probably somewhere around the garden. Men have always tried to excuse their sin by some logical method. So as far as it being used, I think it goes back to the very beginning. That man will try to excuse himself. Adam said, "Why did I sin? It was the woman that you gave me that gave me to eat." So he looked at Eve. "It was the serpent that made me." When you got to the devil, he didn't have anywhere to pass the buck, so he was stuck. But what did Adam and Eve do? They passed it all. Eve did it? No, the serpent did it. We all have ways of excusing our sin with very twisted logic. But in popular study, casuistry has always been most closely related to two religious expressions, Judaism and Roman Catholicism. I wish I would have paused and let you guess those two. I think you probably could have. You're familiar with the Gospels and what Jesus says about the Pharisees, and I've already given you one example of the Roman Catholics via their sect of the Jesuits. Popular study, it has its strongest development in Judaism and Roman Catholicism. Let's start with Judaism. Now, we will see more of this later in the intertestamental period study, but you're already aware somewhat of how the rabbis twisted Scripture to their own advantage. Matthew chapter 23, Jesus blisters the scribes and Pharisees. Not for the practice of casuistry per se, that is the first definition, where you take a moral principle and say, now, we don't live back in Sinai, in the Sinai wilderness, the Sinai desert where this law was given. Now, we live in Palestine, or we would say today, now we live in modern, industrialized, urbanized, 20th century United States of America. So how does that principle apply today? That's fine to do. All good students of Scripture have to do that. Look back there and see what was said and ask ourselves, how does it apply today? So he blisters them, not for the practice of casuistry per se, but an inappropriate use of it. For instance, in verse 4, we're in Matthew 23. In verse 4, they twisted the law to bind others, but found ways out themselves. They put burdens on men's backs and wouldn't lift them with one of their fingers, but they wouldn't burden themselves with that, though. So there's a form of casuistry. I think I've given you this example. It's kind of like the classic example as far as the rabbis and their casuistry is concerned. Now, there's an Old Testament commandment that said that you're not to do any work on the Sabbath. Now, that's a notoriously broad commandment. We have a few stipulations. You cannot cook on the Sabbath. You cannot start a fire. You cannot gather sticks. You cannot work. But what does work mean? I mean, how much? Could you get up and go to the restroom? Could you change your child's diaper? What would be considered work? Well, it's kind of open-ended there. Some things are definitely defined. You can't gather sticks. A man was killed for doing that. because that was in violation of that law. You can't start a fire, you can't cook with a fire, and in essence, you can't work. That means you can't go out in your field and labor and all of this type of stuff. So it's notoriously open-ended and broad. And so the rabbis, they came up with their own interpretation of that in so many different areas. In Matthew 12, Jesus criticized them for the same thing again, because he said, you've got a law about the Sabbath where you would never allow your ox or your ass to stay down in the bottom of that pit the whole day, but you won't let me heal a man, though. Now that's casuistry gone to seed. To rescue an ox or an ass and not allow a man to be healed. They considered rescuing the ox or ass not to be work. And that would take a lot more strenuous labor pulling that creature up out of there than Jesus just touching someone and saying, be healed. But Jesus, in doing that, violated their definition of work. They said you could only travel so far, let's just say a mile. Now beyond that was considered work on the Sabbath day. And so here's where Pharisee number 1 exists. This is where he lives. And this represents 1 mile. You can't travel any beyond this on the Sabbath day. But you see, on the Sabbath day, he knows he has an important appointment right down here, which is 2 miles away from home. And so they invented a law that said you can't travel more than a mile, just rounding it off. You can't travel more than a mile on the Sabbath day. But he's got to get down here. So they had another law invented that if the day before the Sabbath you traveled to the extent of 1 mile, you could deposit some of your goods, your home belongings, and this would represent your home away from home. A second, a Vermont home, a second home here. And then you could go back home, and on the Sabbath day, now you can travel to here. You only traveled 1 mile from home. Now you can travel to here, 1 mile from home. This is home and that is home. And, the rabbis had this down to a science. Down to a science of what could and couldn't be done. And yet also how if they need to get around that, then they can get around it. And of course, then you could put some belongings here and you can go 3 miles. And put some more there and go 4 miles. And so you made a law that said you can't travel more than 1 mile. And if we want to measure this distance, he's going 2 miles then. So he broke his own law. But he really didn't, because this is now his second home, his home away from home. So this is what Jesus is blistering them for, their casuistical studies. They've taken moral principles, laws from the Old Testament. You can't work on the Sabbath. And with such twisted logic have explained everything, to their own benefit. So in verse 4, he said that they twisted the law to bind others, but they found ways out for themselves. And here's really the heart of the error of casuistry, verse 23 of Matthew 23. Jesus argued here that you missed the whole point of the law. While you were involved in your tithing a little bit of these seeds and a little bit over here, while you were doing that, you missed the whole point of the law, judgment and mercy and faith. And that's what generally happens with the casuist. We would have, and here's what would have happened to us. See, I don't think we did this, and I'll show you why next week, but we would have said, all right, it's wrong to lie. We would have gotten so far away from that fact by looking at all the examples that it's wrong to lie, that by the time we got to the end, it was okay to lie. And so we missed the whole point of the fact that God said, don't bear false witness. Lie not one to another. That's what generally happens with the casuist. So Judaism is well known for that. Secondly, Roman Catholicism is probably the best known modern example of casuistry. Some of the early church writers began using it. Just give you a little history and lead right up into Catholicism proper. Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria, in his 2 books, Pedagogue and his other book, Who is the Rich Man That Is Saved? Question mark. he seems to use casuistry there. Ambrose, in his book on the duties of the clergy, uses it. Ambrose on the duties of the clergy, which is modeled after Cicero's on duties. And if you want a cross-reference note for your tapes, we discussed Ambrose's book and Cicero's book on CE tape 18, Christian Ethics tape 18. We discussed Ambrose's book on the duties of the clergy, how it's modeled on Cicero's on duties. And then Augustine's on lying, which would be very appropriate for us, on lying. Now there are some of the early church writers that believed in the moral principle, the principle of moral study of casuistry. But we might really date its origin to the penitentials. Well, you can spell that, I'm sure. Penitents. The penitentials. The penitentials were books of various sins and, appropriate penances that would be done for those sins that first arose in the British Isles between the 7th and the 10th centuries. The penitentials, now these are books that list sins, all types of sin that you could think of, any type of sin you could think of, and would list an appropriate form of penance that would need to be done for that sin to put oneself back in right standing with God. And so you see casuistry creeping up right here to go to all the trouble of listing all the sins that could possibly humanly be thought of. And then to list right out beside that, it would be, an equation here, right out beside that, the appropriate penance necessary for this. They arose in the British Isles between the 7th and the 10th centuries. And then after the Fourth Lateran Council, Lateran, at this council in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, annual confession to a priest was imposed on all Christians. And this was by law, by church law. Annual confession, once a year confession, was imposed. Now you could do it, of course, more often if you sin more often, but at least it had to be Day of Atonement type thing. It had to be once a year. Annual confession was imposed on all Christians. So these books, these penitentials, really gained in popularity because now with it church or canon law for all Christians to have to come and confess to their priests at least once a year, then this priest is going to be hearing all different types of sins committed. What's he going to tell these people? He's got to know the proper form of penance to tell them to do to rid themselves of this moral blemish on their soul. And so the popularity of these books and their widespread use in nature, the penitentials, becomes apparent here because all the priests would need copies of the penitentials to know what to tell these confessing sinners to do as a result of their sin. And so by the 15th century, these books were just stereotypical and were just the rule. Now, what I'm saying is that the Roman Catholic science of casuistry arose over the question of how to deal with different types of sin. Remember what we're dealing with. Casuistry, where you want to take a moral principle, don't sin, and if you do sin, well, their principle, would be, do something to erase that. But what do you do? Well, different sins would bring up different types of penance. And so the whole history of casuistry in the Roman Catholic Church is due to the penitentials. The question over how to deal with different types of sins. The Catholics have two big categories of sins, the venial ones and the mortal ones. The mortal ones are bad ones, and the venial ones are the slight ones, and you can get away with those if you do some form of penance. But even the same sin for two different people carried with it different degrees of culpability due to the variables. Who did it? When did they do it? Where did they do it? Why did they do it? You see, notice even in our secular culture here in America, don't we have different degrees of homicide? We don't just say homicide is homicide. There are different degrees because of the variables. You could have two people kill someone. Person A kills someone, person B. We have different levels of guilt, different levels of culpability due to the variables. And this is what they're trying to deal with. Now, you could have venial sins, but maybe person A needs to do a greater, more stringent form of penance than does person B, because person B's motives were purer than person A. And this is where it became extremely difficult trying to deal with the variables. Now it's no longer, sin A has penance A to go along with it. Now sin A has maybe 100 or 200 different forms of penance depending on who the person was. Was it male or female? Young, middle-aged, old? How long in the church? Baptized, influenced by Protestant? Were they sick that day? Old, infirm, mentally incompetent? What was their motive? Where did they do it? When was it done? You try to take all that. This is what casuistry is. It becomes like a whole, you could fill up a whole library with legal works on casuistry. Because how would you find someone? How would you penalize someone? You got to know why they did it, and then you got to trust what they're telling you. You probably got some other things to judge whether or not what they're telling you is the truth. Why you did it, where did you do it, with whom was it done, when was it done? And so no longer is it one sin and one penance, and so it's all evenly matched up. But now it just becomes full-blown. And after the Council of Trent, it was casuistry was a required study of the part of training for the priesthood, for all priests. And you could see why. It's tantamount to becoming a church lawyer to have ever mastered the study of casuistry. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that whenever two people commit the same sin, that there are different degrees of culpability. We would certainly agree with that. Definitely we would agree with that. And I think our country's laws on homicide, and the Bible has laws on that. It talks about if you're in the woods with a friend swinging an axe, cutting a tree, and the head of the axe comes off and hits your friend in the head and kills him. Remember, if you kill someone, it was a death penalty. It'll be life for life, but not in this case. Why? It was an accident, accidental homicide. It was not case up. Why? It was an accident, accidental homicide. It was not premeditated. Now, he had to flee and go to one of the refuge cities. That's why they were set up, and he had to live there until the death of the current high priest. But still, at least his life couldn't be taken. And we have that. I mean, it's one thing if you accidentally kill someone. It's another thing if you plan it in advance to murder the individual. Then obviously you're more guilty. Although the deed is the same, both people on the opposite end of the stick, on the receiving end, they end up 6 feet under. Whether your motive was good or bad, or you didn't have a motive one way or the other, they still end up dead. But we should take into consideration the variables, that the person that did the act may be more or less guilty, depending on the variables. And so this is a history of it in Roman Catholicism. And see, I'm no expert in this, because you would have to be a church lawyer to know all about casuistry in the Roman Catholic Church. And they do have some that do know all this. But it's enough for me to know a little bit about it so that I don't want to know any more about it. I don't want to practice this, that's for sure. Now, as time went on, especially with the influx of the influences of the Reformation, then this system became more and more and more developed. But the church was not always in agreement. The whole Roman Catholic Church was not always in agreement over how they should practice their casuistry. In other words, should it tend more towards the legal, and it's certainly legal through and through. Should it tend more toward the legal or more toward the lenient? And so through these, 16th, 17th, 18th century, I guess, we have the following stages and the following development of casuistry in the Roman Catholic Church. The first stage is known as probabilism. They happen to correspond with centuries as well. So we're talking about the 16th century here. As we go along, it'll be the 17th century and then it'll be the 18th century. Probabilism. The words only get longer as we go along. That's the shortest one of them all. Probabilism. P-R-O-B-A-B, did I spell that right? B-I-L-I-S-M, yes, probabilism. Now this was the direction to which the Catholic Church was swinging in the 16th century, was casuistical probabilism. They still practice casuistry, but there are different forms of casuistry, one leaning toward the legal and one toward the lenient. And the first strong emphasis was probabilism. Now, let me define probabilism for you. When the rightness or wrong, and you can see why casuistry is to moral argument, what sophistry is to that of a philosophical nature. When the rightness or wrongness of an act is in question, then a probable opinion in favor of liberty may be followed even when the contrary opinion is more probable. When the rightness or wrongness of an act, and again, you use these things in your own life, and you don't know their technical terms, and don't worry about trying to memorize it. We just need to know what to do and what not to do. When the rightness or wrongness of an act is in question, just think of anything, of all these things we've already brought up in ethics, and some things we haven't gotten around to answering yet, doing certain things on the Sabbath day, on Sunday. Whether you can go fishing with, an artificial worm, artificial bait. The rightness or wrongness of an act is in question, then a probable opinion in favor of liberty. So that would be, yes, you can go fishing with a plastic worm. Yes, you can do whatever on Sunday. A probable opinion in favor of liberty may be followed, even when the contrary opinion is more probable. This is where they started, and of course this was really a bad place to start. A probable opinion in favor of liberty may be followed, even when the contrary opinion is more probable. That means that we have 60% calls not to believe this or do this, 40% calls to believe it or do it. And according to probabilism, as long as you have probable opinion or probable right, then you can lean toward liberty in the 40%. Even though the majority is against that, the weight is against that, you have the right, if you have probable opinion in favor of liberty, of leaning toward the lesser side. The liberty side, the 40% side. Now, that is somewhat analogous to our legal maxim, innocent until proven guilty. It's somewhat similar. Now, the parallel is not exact, but it's somewhat similar to our legal principle, innocent until proven guilty. In other words, we assume liberty. If we've got guilt versus innocence, we're going to start with innocence. We're going to assume that. And we're not going to swap over to the guilty side until that side can be proven. And remember, people can be let out of jail on the 40% because you've got to have the case nailed shut, that this person is guilty. And so it's very similar to our principle, innocent until proven guilty. Now, I'm not saying that we should reverse that and say that everyone should be guilty until proven innocent. Now, that's a big question. Which of those, or maybe we need to invent a third one to practice. But probabilism is certainly very similar to innocent until proven guilty. You see, what that assumes is that guilt takes more proof than does innocence. That innocence, well, as our founding fathers said, is more or less a God-given right. That innocence is your right for people to assume that of you, and that guilt takes more proof than does innocence. But innocence, in other words, is a given. Innocence is out in the open, and you start with innocence. And the only way you can get to guilt is to prove it. Rather than start with guilt, we're going to assume that you're guilty, and therefore innocence would take more proof, because the only way you'll go from being guilty to being innocent is we have to have proof that you're innocent. It was taught first by the Dominican Medina in 1577. He's the one who uses the term, the Dominican Medina, M-E-D-I-N-A, his last name, I believe. In 1577, probabilism. Now let me give you 4 steps to this. You can see the Pharisees in this and the scribes. Let me give you 4 steps to Medina's theory here. I'll have to start with a statement, as we've already discussed here. An act that would normally be thought wrong, 60%, the weight is on the negative side. An act that would normally be thought wrong might be allowed if points 1, 2, 3, and 4. They give 4 points here. An act normally thought to be wrong. This is probabilism. Such as lying. Lying is normally wrong, but there may be occasions when it's not wrong. An act normally thought wrong might be justified if, number 1, it is more right than its opposite. Number 2, if it is an exception to the command. See, that's possible, but it depends on what type of commands we're talking about. That's why we had to discuss long ago in Christian ethics, are the moral standards of Scripture absolute? In moral areas, they are. Therefore, there are no exceptions to those. In ceremonial, technical, legal matters, well, there may be exceptions in, but not in moral areas. There are no exceptions. But for them, that an act normally a moral, ethical deed, normally thought wrong, would be allowed if, 2, it is an exception to the rule, to the command. Or 3, if it falls within a qualification. So this is wrong except if it meets these qualifications, then it's right. Such as, to give you examples, lying would be wrong unless it fits the qualification of serving to save someone's life. Nazi Germany then. You see, that's where this would fit right here. It's normally wrong, but it would be okay if it fits a certain qualification. It serves a life-saving function. Or number 4, aren't you glad we don't have to study these things? It's just best to stay with the Word and say, don't tell a lie. Instead of invent all the possible cases where it may be okay, and then what type of penance you have to perform if you do something wrong. It's best just to repent and ask for forgiveness. It's the best thing to do when you found yourself to be in error. If a lofty inner motive, now we knew we'd get to this, transcends the external violation. If a lofty inner motive, in other words, well, I didn't mean to do wrong, transcends the external violation. You say, well, what does the Bible have to say about something like that? Well, a person is still wrong, but there would be different degrees of guilt, though. If a person did something wrong, or if a person premeditatively, they knew what they were doing, they planned to do it, or if someone slipped and made a mistake. They didn't mean to do it. Well, you're still guilty according to Scripture. It's still a sin. But there's different degrees of guilt, though. So here they're going to actually justify, though, something that's normally thought to be morally wrong, as long as you have an inner motive that is so lofty that it exceeds the technical transgression, the external violation. Now, just prior to Medina's teaching of this, 1577. The Jesuits had been formed. They were formed in 1540. And of course, their mission was to counteract the thrust of the Reformation and to help deal with some of the modern, contemporary problems in the world that weren't really dealt with in Scripture. And so the Jesuits became the casuists par excellence in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, they were a little bit different, though, than Medina. They didn't so much deal with great universal laws or principles and then, try to apply it somewhere. But they analyzed everything case by case. And here's how it's kind of been developed in the Roman Catholic Church. It starts off, taking a general moral law and seeing just how it applies. But it ends up forgetting about the moral law and just starting with each individual case and analyzing it. So they would analyze everything, volume after volume after volume. Politics, economics, religion, lying, gossiping, cheating, stealing, killing, adultery, sexual sins, lust. Anything you could think of, any form of sin, by anyone, in any case, every single case, they would analyze it and put a certain degree of guilt beside that and attach an appropriate expression of penance beside that. Well, the problem with probabilism is that this principle can lead, and it did lead, to great freedom and liberty and laxity and sin, because only slight probability was needed for any cause to be right. Remember, as long as you have a probable opinion in favor of liberty, then you can follow that, even when the contrary opinion is more probable. So that is so perverse, that is wicked, to come up with this framework of thinking. It's going to automatically lead to great liberty and freedom and laxity and lead to sin in the church, because all you need is slight probability in order to justify anything that you want to do. You don't have to have a large majority of proof, slight probability, and that will justify the deed. So the church leaders somewhat reacted against that because of its obvious problems that it would bring up. And so let's secondly come to a development of that, a reaction against that. Probabiliorism. P-R-O-B-A-B-I-L-I-O-R-I-S-M. Probabiliorism. Or I think I left out a syllable, probabiliorism. Throw in one more syllable. P-R-O-B-A-B-I-L-I-O-R-I-S-M. Notice everything is based on probable opinion. It's what it's all based on. Probabiliorism. Now, this was the 17th century reaction by French Catholics to probabilism, which was taught in the 16th century. This was the 17th century reaction by French Catholics, known as the Jansenists. Well, you don't need to get that down. They were kind of an unorthodox French sect of Roman Catholicism. What is it? It's somewhat the reverse of probabilism. Somewhat, not exactly, but somewhat guilty until proven innocent. A deed, in other words, that's generally thought to be wrong is wrong until you can prove in this case that it's allowed. Whereas remember in the other case, with probabilism, it's just the reverse of that. Here, the most solidly probable opinion is to be followed. The most solidly probable opinion. Whereas before, all you needed was probable opinion, even when the contrary opinion was more probable. Now you need a solidly probable opinion, and this must be followed. To give it to you in yet another way, the rule must be followed as such as thou shalt not lie. The rule must be followed as long as its supporting argument is more probable than the liberty side, or at least equal to it. It had to be greater than or equal to. The rule must be followed as long as its supporting argument is more probable than the liberty side or at least equal to it. Now this is a much better view, much better based on the Scripture view than probabilism. So you say, now how would this ever apply to my life? Well, take any moral question in your life that you still are throwing around in your mind. Well, look at what evidence that you have. Where is the more probable opinion? Then according to probabilism, you would follow the more probable opinion. Whatever it is, you follow what is more probable. In other words, if you have some doubt about that, then you don't do that. And that seems to be what Paul teaches. If you have some doubt about it, you just don't do it. Because the doubt that you already have gives more evidence on your side, in your favor. Whereas for our first view, our first stage of development in probabilism, it doesn't matter how weighty the other side is. As long as you have some tiny hope, some probable opinion in your favor, in favor of liberty, in favor of doing this that you want to do, or not doing what you don't want to do, then you're simply allowed to follow that. So this is certainly the more scriptural of the two. Now, as I said, the Jansenists were the great proponents of this, and they enlisted on their side Blaise Pascal, the famous mathematician, remember? Pascal. They enlisted on their side. Now, he was a French mathematician. The Jansenists enlisted on their side Blaise Pascal. Now, Pascal was already very opposed to the Jesuits, and he was looking for an avenue of attack on them, their theology. And so whenever the Jansenists came to him with this business of casuistry and the twisted form of probabilism, then he chose as the topic of his attack casuistry. And he did a very witty satire against it that he called Provincial Letters, which has become a classic since then. Provincial Letters, written in 1656 and 1657. Blaise Pascal. And we discussed Pascal earlier in Christian ethics as well. He wanted to attack, see, he didn't like Jesuits to begin with. And he wanted some avenue, some topic to pick as a point of contention. And so whenever the Jansenists came to him with the Jesuit excesses of casuistry and probabilism, then Pascal chose as his topic casuistry. He did a very witty satire against it in Provincial Letters, which has become a classic. One theologian in California writes the following about Pascal's Provincial Letters. The moral acrobatics which resulted from the Jesuit practice are devastatingly analyzed in Pascal's Provincial Letters. I've never read the book, but I would know what I would say about it. And I'm sure someone with a mind like a mathematician such as Pascal would have had, he could have done a very, very able job. The moral acrobatics, and that's what you have, a juggling scene on your hands of when something is right and when it's wrong. Bromley said the moral acrobatics which resulted from the Jesuit practice of casuistry and probabilism are devastatingly analyzed in Pascal's Provincial Letters. All right, papal decrees in 1679 and 1690 condemned, respectively, both the laxists and the legalists. Those from stage 1, probabilism, and stage 2, probabilism. In 1679 and 1690, papal decrees condemned both the laxists, the probabilists, and they thought the legalists, the probabilists. And so the 18th century saw the rise of a mediating position. Comes to our third development, and we will conclude with this morning. the 18th, and we've gone through 16th century probabilism, 17th century probabilism, 18th century equiprobabilism. Just put EQUI on the front of your first word. So we need equilibrium here, in other words. Equiprobabilism. This was the theory of one Alphonsus, who died in 1787. Now it sounds like a mediating position from its title, equiprobabilism, as though it's equilibrium, a balancing out. In essence, however, it returns to the first position of probabilism. Now, I have a long definition that I'll quote from someone else because you probably couldn't think of it better. You may not be able to get all of this down. But just get down what I just said. If you know that, you pretty much know it. It's a little bit different, or it wouldn't be a third position. They just return to the first. But I say in essence it's a return to the laxists, the libertines, the probabilists in the first case. It's a return to the first position of probabilism. Okay, here's what equiprobabilism is. It appeals to the legal maxim that in the case of doubt, the one in possession has the better claim. Now, in other words, they're drawing from legal, from court law, that in the case of dispute, that the one in possession of whatever object is under discussion, the one in possession of that has the better claim. Now, that's, of course, that's a false law. Maybe they stole it, and that's how they got it. Remember with Solomon and the two harlots there, and the one that came to him is the one who had the baby that wasn't hers. Now, if he would have followed this law and said, well, possession equals better claim, then he would have given the baby to the wrong mother. And it was the other mother that really owned the baby. Thus, if the doubt concerns the existence of a particular obligation, and if the argument in favor of liberty is at least equally probable, then it is held that this suffices to confirm our liberty, which is already in possession in toto. But if the doubt concerns the cessation of a recognized obligation, and if the argument in favor of liberty, you still with me, is not more than equally probable, then we must conclude that the law, which is already in possession in toto, continues to oblige them. It's based on this thing of possession. And in one thing we have the deed in possession, and in the other alternative we have the law, the moral principle in possession. And therefore whatever is in possession has the better claim of being right. So that almost is saying, as long as you're doing something bad, you're already doing it. Then since you're doing it, the very act of its existence proves that you have the better claim because you possess the evil. Amen. So you're right back to the libertines of probabilism then. I find this just amazingly humorous. Not amazingly interesting, but amazingly humorous that men have gone to such depths. It appeals to the legal maxim that in the case of doubt, the one in possession has a better claim. Thus, if the doubt concerns the existence underlined of a particular obligation, and if the argument in favor of liberty is at least equally probable, it is held that this suffices to confirm our liberty, which is already in possession. But if the doubt concerns the cessation of a recognized obligation, and if the argument in favor of liberty is not more than equally probable, we must conclude that the law, rather than the existence of the deed, the law, which is already in possession, continues to oblige them. So that really returns to probabilism. Now, to conclude with, so all you needed to get down was that, just mark it back up with probabilism as far as it's just a more sophistical, casuistical way of explaining probabilism. But that's interesting how people can think like that. If you're already doing the deed, and you already have your underlying maxim or principle that possession equals better claim, then once you're doing it, you're okay. As long as you can get doing it quickly before you learn not to, then you're okay. If you ever learn not to, then you have the law first before the deed, and so the law would then continue to oblige. Twisted logic. See, that's perverted logic there, and it's to justify sin. Now, where does the Roman Catholic Church stand today? The Roman Catholic Church officially stands with equal probabilism. Roman Catholic Church officially today stands with equal probabilism. Protestants have not done the type of work that the Catholic scholars have in these sophistical casuistical concerns. Catholic scholars, brilliant thinkers, and you can see that's going to take quite a mind to think some of these ideas up. The Catholic Church has, through the centuries, been blessed with some of the top-notch thinkers of the world. And Protestants fall far behind when it comes to this ability to think and reason. But you see, you reason your way right out of God's kingdom in the Scriptures, though. Most Protestants have steered clear of this whole debate around casuistry because of its potential for abuse. Now, Fletcher and Robinson's situation ethics has a resemblance to casuistry and to equal probabilism. But we're running out of time, so I'll pick up with that next week then. Think back on situation ethics, and there is a resemblance. Now, we're going to point out similarities and differences, I think, is how we'll begin next week. But situation ethics does have a resemblance here to casuistry, where right and wrong may swap places depending on the situation. It's not nearly as developed as the Roman Catholic view of equal probabilism, but it certainly has its similarities.